Welcome back to Outside Views, and look at the state of the United Kingdom today and tell me with a straight face that the grand experiment of the last decade has been anything other than a slow-motion car crash. It's January 2026, and the silence that has hung over the British political landscape for years regarding the B word is finally, mercifully being shattered by the cold, hard weight of reality. For so long, it felt like the entire country was trapped in a collective omerta, a pact of silence where no one wanted to admit that the emperor was not only naked, but shivering in the cold of geopolitical isolation. But the numbers coming out of 2025 have made it impossible to keep the lid on the pot any longer. By June 2025, we saw a staggering 56% of Britons openly admitting that the country should never have left the European Union. By September of that same year, that figure climbed even higher, with 62% of respondents in YouGov polls labeling the entire project as a categorical failure. And my personal view is that we are witnessing the final death of a delusion, a moment where the sunlit uplands have been revealed to be nothing more than a foggy, expansive swamp. And the outside view is that the British public has moved past the stage of anger and into a stage of profound systemic regret. It's not just about a bad deal or a botched implementation anymore. It's about the realization that the very foundation of the 2016 campaign was built on a series of elaborate and expensive lies. Think back to that red bus and the promise of £350 million a week for the National Health Service. In 2026, the NHS is struggling more than ever, and that phantom money has never materialized because, as it turns out, you can't fund a healthcare system with the dividends of a shrinking economy. And even the fiscal watchdogs, like the Office for Budget Responsibility, have been forced to double down on their grim projections. Their data from 2025 suggests that leaving the US already slashed the UK's global trade volume by 15% and cut productivity by 4% in the long term. And some independent studies are even more brutal, suggesting that by 2025, the British GDP per capita was 6 to 8% lower than it would have been if they had stayed in the room where the decisions were made. And I find it absolutely incredible that for 5 years politicians tried to pretend these numbers didn't exist or that they were just teething problems. Well, the teeth have fallen out, and the British economy is now trying to chew on a global market that doesn't care about its sovereign feelings. What we are seeing now in early 2026 is a fundamental shift in the strategy of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. In 2024, he was the king of caution, a man so terrified of alienating the red wall Brexit voters that he barely dared to whisper the word Europe. He played a safe game, focusing on, making Brexit work, which was always a bit like trying to make a square wheel roll, but the shift in the autumn of 2025 then was quite tectonic. Recognizing that the economic ambiguity of his first year was no longer sustainable, Starmer has finally started to name the ghost in the room. He began to clearly and forcefully condemn the lies of the 2016 referendum, specifically calling out the fraudulent promises about migration and the NSS. And I believe he had no choice. You can only tell the people to wait for the growth for so long before they notice that the shelves are still half empty and the prices are still skyrocketing. His government is now pushing the EU reset bill through Parliament. I talked about this in the last days. A piece of legislation that marks the most significant turn towards Brussels since the 2016 vote. And this bill isn't just about mood music. It's about creating a mechanism for regulatory alignment in critical sectors like agri-foods and electricity. And my view is that this is kind of a Swiss-style deal by stealth, but don't mix that up. Swiss style is still something very different. But it's a slow crawl back toward the single market because the Global Britain alternative has turned out to be a lonely island in a stormy sea. And the Conservatives, meanwhile, have gone curiously silent on their signature achievement. After the chaotic, almost surreal tenures of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, The Tory party seems to have realized that boasting about Brexit is an electoral death wish. They failed to produce a single tangible benefit for the average citizen, and they know it, even though Jacob Rees-Mogg is still trying to sneak in his adversity of Europe and everything, even when he talks about Trump, like he did 2 days ago when I've seen that. But even Nigel Farage, the man who arguably did more than anyone to pull the UK out of the EU, seems to have lost interest in his own creation. In 2025, he shifted his focus entirely, moving from attacking the Brussels bureaucrats to his new all-time favorite scapegoat, the immigrants. And it's a classic move. When the freedom you promised turns into a disaster, you just find a new group of people to blame for the mess that you made. And the irony is that many of the people who voted for Brexit to take back control of their borders are now seeing higher levels of legal migration than ever before, because a modern economy needs people to function. And I think the British public is finally connecting the dots and realizing that they were sold a bill of goods by people who have no plan for the day after the vote. Look at the trade deal with the United States that was signed in May 2025, even if we leave out Greenland out of the whole thing. It was supposed to be the golden prize of Brexit, the deal that would make everything worth it. But as of January 2026, the gains from that deal have been described as modest at best, covering only a fraction of the trade lost with the European neighbors. And with the US shifting toward more aggressive unilateral tariffs in 2025, the UK has found that being a special friend doesn't mean much when the Americans decide to put their own interest first. And once again, we've seen that now with Greenland and the threat of more tariffs, even on the UK. And the outside view is that the UK is currently caught in a pincer movement between an isolationist US and a protective EU. The unraveling of the Western alliance has forced Starmer to realize that he cannot rely on a transatlantic life raft that might not even be there in 2 years. He needs allies, and he needs them close to home. And I believe the 2026 reset is a desperate yet necessary acknowledgement that geography is destiny. You cannot trade more with a country thousands of miles away than you do with a massive market on your doorstep without paying a heavy price on productivity and living standards. The British people are feeling this in their wallets every single day. And when 62% of your population thinks a major national policy is a failure, you aren't just looking at unpopularity, you are looking at a crisis of legitimacy. The regret isn't just a meme, it's a living, breathing political force that is reshaping the map of British politics, even if Reform's anti-immigrant stand still works. But I find it fascinating that the Liberal Democrats are now pushing to amend the government's bill to force a vote on rejoining a customs union, by 2030. And for the first time in a decade, that doesn't sound like a fringe fantasy. It sounds like a serious proposal that a significant portion of the electorate would support, even if it wouldn't bring the gains they are thinking it would. To be in a customs union is still something very different than being in the customs union. And the single market is even much more important than the customs union, and they cannot join the single market without being a member. But the youth of Britain are particularly clear on this. Among the 18 to 24-year-olds, believe that Brexit was the right choice has dropped to almost nothing. And they are the ones who will have to live with the consequences of this decision for the next 50 years at least, and they are understandably furious. And I think the dynamic alignment that Starmer is proposing, where the UK keeps its rules in lockstep with the EU, is at the moment, under the current circumstances, the only way to stop the bleeding at least a little bit. It will not stop it all the time, because we know as soon as the EU changes something, they have to be really fast, etc. I explained that in the last days. But let's be honest, this is also an admission of defeat. It means the UK will be following rules it no longer has a seat at the table to ride. That is the sovereignty they were promised. The right to do exactly what Brussels says, but with no vote this time. And I believe the next 2 years will be defined by a series of parliamentary battles over how close is too close. And the government is talking about a security and defense partnership, about linking emission trading schemes, and about professional qualification recognition. These are all the things they had before 2016, and they are now spending billions of pounds and thousands of hours of diplomatic time just to get back to a fraction of what they used to have. And it would be funny if it weren't so tragic for the millions of people who have seen their opportunities shrink. And my strong personal view is that the 2016 referendum was the greatest act of self-harm ever committed by a developed nation in the modern era. The B word is no longer a source of pride for anyone but the most dogmatic ideologues, and I still see some of them in the comments of my videos every day. But for the rest of the country, it's a burden, a tax on their future, and a reminder of a time when they were lied to by people who are now nowhere to be found, or nowhere want to seem to have anything to do with that, like a certain Mr. F. And as we look ahead through 2026, the question is no longer if the UK will move closer to Europe, but how fast. And the outside view is that the gravity of the European single market is simply too strong to resist, especially for a medium-sized economy that has tried and failed to find a better alternative. The road back will be long, it will be expensive, and it will be humiliating at times. But the alternative, staying out in the cold, watching your productivity rot while your neighbors grow together, is simply no longer an option. The debate isn't just reignited, it's the only fire burning in the British political house right now. And I believe that by the end of this year, the reset will have to go much further than just alignment if Starmer wants to actually deliver the growth he promised. The public wants evidence of rising living standards and not just stabilization. They want their country back, but not the version of the country that Nigel Farage sold them. They want a country that works, that trades, and that doesn't treat its closest friends like enemies. The Brexit era is here, and it's not going away until the UK finds its way back to the heart of Europe. And it's time to stop pretending that the sunlit uplands are just over the next hill. The hill is a cliff, and the only way down is together. And that's definitely where they don't want to go. And it's time for some honesty, because in the end, the damage can only be repaired by joining the EU again. But that requires a lot more than just a referendum or whatever. They have to do a lot of homework now, because as someone in the comments regularly writes, which is absolutely correct, and you know who I mean, the UK has to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria to be a candidate for the EU. And it doesn't fulfill those criteria at the moment. There's a lot they need to work on before they can even really get joining again in motion. And before the discussion even happens in the UK, and that proper discussion needs to happen, but that when that happens, it still depends on when they finally realize that they have no other choice. And I know a lot of people who will say, we don't want back. And another bunch will say, we don't want you back. And I can understand that one very much as well, after the treatment the EU got and the people, the European Union member populations got from the British in the last 10 years. But they need to work on the Copenhagen criteria. And that will be a lot of work as well. And the sooner they start that, the shorter the time will be. And they have to get started on that. Otherwise, we will really talk about time frames that were called out by Jean-Claude Juncker or Michael Gove or JRM and many others and Tusk around the time of the referendum.